anywhere. We are LA Talk Radio at latalkradio.com.
You're listening to Cannabis Nation with your hosts, Mike Booten and Julie Rose, right here on LA Talk Radio.
Welcome, Cannabis Nation.
And welcome to Cannabis Nation. Listeners can go to the guest info page on our website, cannabisnationradio.com, to get more information about tonight's guest, Sean Dunagan, and be sure to like us on Facebook at facebook.com/reformwarrior.
Yeah, and you guys, I have some sad news to report. I don't know if you've heard or if you knew of this young fellow. His name was Cash. His family called him Cashy Hyde. He died this last week, and he had his cannabis taken away from him. He was doing pretty good, but he lost his fight. And so, you know what? We just wanted to give a shout-out and give our condolences here at CNR. And, you know, if you guys want to show some love, go find the Cash Hyde website and maybe help those guys out. Anyway, you know, folks, the war on drugs, it isn't fought by just one group. It's fought by every group imaginable with a badge, and some without. For example, you watch Wild Justice on TV, and it's California game wardens, and you're going to see a lot of marijuana interdiction. We've got the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Forest Service, destroying the forest with mismanagement, and yet they seem to live for marijuana interdiction. And I'm not saying that what goes on out in the forest ought not be challenged, but the cartels are there because of prohibition.
That's right, Mike, and you've also got the CIA, the FBI, the ATF, scores of local and regional and federal forces and departments, and we've got the Coast Guard, too. You've mentioned drones and in-flight fueling above your house, and it's the military now who are involved as well. And one group that is at the top of the list is the DEA, or the Drug Enforcement Administration, who was created by President Richard Nixon through an executive order in July of 1973. At its inception, the DEA had 1,470 special agents and a budget of less than $75 million. Today, the DEA has nearly 5,000 special agents and a budget of $2.02 billion.
Wow. Yeah, isn't that special? Tricky Dick deciding for everyone how it ought to be. You know what? He was actually recorded on the White House tapes, sorry about that, in 1971 talking to Bob Haldeman, and this is how it went. Nixon: now this is one thing I want. I want a goddamn strong statement on marijuana. Can I get that out of this son of a bitch in our domestic council? Haldeman: sure. Nixon: I mean one on marijuana that just tears the ass out of them. I see another thing in the news summary this morning about it. You know, it's a funny thing. Every one of the bastards that are out for legalizing marijuana is Jewish. What the Christ does it matter with the Jews, Bob? What's the matter with them? I suppose it's because most of them are psychiatrists, you know. There's so many. All the greatest psychiatrists are Jewish. By God, we're going to hit the marijuana thing, and I want to hit it right square in the puss. Haldeman: yep. Julie, can you imagine a U.S. president talking like that now?
Wow, Mike, he was pretty passionate for sure. And by the way, your imitation is pretty good.
Oh, good.
But today we have with us a former member of Nixon's DEA and current member of LEAP, or Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. From 1998 to 2011, Sean Dunagan served as a senior intelligence research specialist for the DEA and took part in dozens of federal drug investigations during tours of duty in Florida, Pennsylvania, as well as internationally in Mexico and Guatemala. Sean, welcome to Cannabis Nation Radio.
Oh, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be on with you. Thank you.
Wow, thanks. Welcome, Sean. Hey, you didn't actually tear the ass out of anyone, did you?
I did not. No, I did not. and I was actually born, I believe, the year that Nixon left office. So I don't know that I actually worked for his DEA, but it is the same. It is the organization, and wonderful impersonation.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, I wasn't trying to hang Tricky Dick on you, but you know. So let's start out with the basic stuff. When, where, why the DEA? I mean, I know you had a law enforcement family, but what made you want to become a DEA agent and a DEA agent, and how did that exactly happen?
Yeah, it's interesting. I didn't really come into DEA as necessarily a drug warrior, right? I was more kind of indifferent.
Right.
Most people my age, kind of grew up in the DARE generation, right? Just say no. So there wasn't, it's not that I really had this bloodlust for going after the drug cartels or people who use drugs, but it was kind of just understood culturally, for that generation, for the vast majority of people, that, this was an evil and this was something that should be fought, and there was no. So I kind of went into it for that purpose, I just kind of assumed, based on everything I had heard and been taught and read up to that point in my life, that this was the right path.
Wait a minute. So you said you got into the DA because you were part of the DARE generation. So are you saying that you feel that DARE was effective for you?
Oh, well, no, I wouldn't say that. No, I wouldn't say that, but I do think, it's... I think that just say no generation. The kids that maybe don't use drugs, and of course DARE is a great program for getting kids to experiment with drugs, as I think it's pretty well proven. But for those who don't, culturally, just the milieu that the kids from that generation grew up in, far more so than today. The idea that the drug war is the correct approach and something worth fighting was just kind of understood and completely unquestioned at that point.
Right.
So I kind of fell into it. It was a government job. It was a good job. I came from a law enforcement family. They were kind of the first federal agency to send me a job offer letter, and that's how I ended up there.
Oh, well, that's interesting. They sent you a letter based on what? College work that you'd done, or there's a whole application process and that. But it was basically. Technically, at the time they were hiring people with certain kinds of backgrounds, and I'd worked in finance, and I think because this is when, it's cyclical. Sometimes they go after supply side, sometimes they go after demand, sometimes they go after drugs, sometimes they go after money and assets, and this was, one of the cycles where, they were looking for people to go and find assets, because of course it's a lot easier to, it's a heck of a lot easier to take money away from someone, whether they're guilty or not, given the state of our forfeiture laws, despite the reforms that have come into place since, than it is to, stop a drug cartel. And it's an awful lot easier to take money away from someone than it is to cure somebody of an addiction. So that's kind of what they were, what they were looking at. I mean, it's policing for profit, unfortunately. And I had, somewhat of a background in the finance industry, and I think that's more than anything was what was appealing about me to them. Well, I think they would need someone like you, irregardless of whether they did asset forfeiture, because, one of the things that you're going to want to know if you're going to be going after organizations is you're going to have to do the math, right? You got to figure out who's making what, where, and...
Yeah, absolutely. And, and that's, I was an intelligence analyst with DEA, and that's it, so it's kind of doing that analytical work of looking at, drug flow assessments and organizational profiles and, profiling of individual targets and that sort of thing. And, in theory, that the idea was to kind of look at the big picture, right? And the way it should work is that, that big picture is kind of gleaned by analysts, and a consensus grows out of that analysis, and that drives policy. But what really happens is that policymakers decide the answer that they want, and then, analysts spend a lot of their time trying to massage the data and get it to fit, what they're being told to produce. Look at it this way. Anytime there's an increase in the use of a particular kind of drug, right, the drug warriors say, well, that proves that we need to put more assets at fighting drugs, right? And when there's a decrease, they say, well, wow, look how well the drug war is working. We need to keep doing what we're doing. So there's no real analysis, right, being done about what enforcement policies or interdiction or prevention policies are effective at reducing drugs. It's just a bureaucracy that kind of exists to expand itself. And no matter what the outcomes of a given policy are, right, their answer is always, well, that proves that we need to expand the war on drugs and hire more DEA agents and toughen up laws and come up with more draconian mandatory minimum sentences and all that. So, it was intelligence analysis, in name, but it was advertising in practice.
So when was the epiphany that it wasn't working?
I don't know that there was a, it's hard to say that there's a particular day. It was certainly a process over my 13 years there. There were certain things, certain things I saw. I think that the first kind of epiphany was going to Guatemala, and that was in 2001. I spent 3 years working for DEA at the U.S. Embassy in Guatemala City, and just seeing, the kind of the poverty and the need in that country. It's a beautiful, wonderful country with wonderful people, but it's poor, and to see the need, for schools and clean water and roads and just the most basic of medical care, particularly outside of the city, and the poverty really was so great. A lot of sustenance farming and that sort of thing. And here, the U.S. government comes in, and what we see as a need in Guatemala is helicopters, right? So there was the push to get helicopters in Guatemala to work on drug interdiction and, training federal agents and the military to engage in the anti-drug fight. So it was just kind of seeing that, in theory, right, we were there to help Guatemala, but in practice we really weren't there to help Guatemala. We could care less. It would seem from our policies, we could really care less what was happening to the people of Guatemala. What we wanted was just, for whatever reason, to establish a larger military and law enforcement presence there and to try to keep drugs from reaching our border. So it's kind of, really, it was a very sad situation, for what we spend training law enforcement. If you look at the Merida Initiative in Mexico, what we spend throwing away at, corrupt military and law enforcement officials, and even those that aren't corrupt. What we spend on that is really better spent on development and nutrition and education.
Well, speaking of corruption, what type of corruption did you see personally?
Oh, well, it's all, of course, in both Guatemala and Mexico, which are the two places I worked long-term overseas, the extent to which the drug cartels have really corrupted, particularly local law enforcement. It's almost absolute. In cities around Monterrey, along the border, our attitude toward local law enforcement agencies was that they were, kind of a uniformed branch of the cartels. More often than not, when they were working and doing something, they were doing so at the behest or for the benefit of a cartel, or the other cartel. And we see that, and that's really why so much of the violence is directed toward law enforcement in Mexico. If we look at the hugely disproportionate percentage of the murders, particularly in northeastern Mexico, Juarez, though that's abated a little bit recently, are law enforcement. And in a small percentage of those cases, it's because, hey, these are cops that are actually out trying to do the right thing. But much more frequently, it's because, these are cops that are working for their own cartel, and it's to send a message.
Right. That's an interesting point for sure, because even myself, as skeptical as I am about the dog and pony show, I really never thought about that before, that, that some of these deaths that they tout as a reason to keep going are actually they were players in the war.
Right.
On the wrong side.
Right. And, and there are exceptions. That's certainly not true of every single Mexican cop that's been killed, but it's true of most of them. And that's
it's pretty common. It's not just drugs. There's a lot of corruption in a lot of the, South American countries. I know I had friends that were stationed in Mexico City, and they didn't have anything to do with law enforcement. He was actually for American Express down there, and they said that there was a time when, I guess I don't know how the garbage pickup is, but they said that they had people with badges come to their door banging on their doors, and the housekeepers told them, don't answer the door. And they were freaked out, they're just, they'd never been through anything like that. And they said, no, what it was is it was a shakedown. They were coming, and I don't even know, they said the police you don't know who to trust. Half of the police are corrupt, and, it's like you don't just pick up the phone and dial 911 and expect that you're going to get a good guy,
Right. Yeah. No, absolutely. And, I was there. I have 4 children. I had 3 at the time that we were in Guatemala, and 4 by the time we got to Mexico. And one of the one of the kind of the cultural adjustments that entails, is kind of teaching kids that, in the States, typically, you teach a kid if you're in trouble, look for a police officer, right? if you're lost, try to find a police officer. And that is just completely the opposite of what you
my word.
You're in Mexico or Guatemala.
I mean, it's that bad.
Just as likely. Yeah, it really is.
Right.
It really is.
Right.
And the impact, of course, the losers in all this, the real tragedy is what happens to the Mexican people. The wealthy, right? There's the real upper classes in all of Latin America, but specifically in Mexico. Essentially are able to afford their own police, right? They have private security guards, they have alarm systems. There's all sorts of that. They are well enough connected to the kind of judicial law enforcement infrastructures that, if they need something done, and nefarious or not, right? They just need, a prosecutor to do his job or a cop to do his job. They can kind of make that happen. But it's really, of course, the middle and lower classes that don't have that access, that can't afford a private security guard, that can't afford an alarm system and bars on their windows, or to live in a secure gated neighborhood, or can't get call their brother-in-law, the mayor, to force an agency to do its job. So the tragedy is really how it affects so many of those people, and I think that's something that's been completely overlooked in American coverage of the drug war. We talk about the body count, and that's horrible, and we talk about the cartels fighting for territory, and that's horrible. But to me, what's really tragic is this whole generation of middle and lower class Mexican families that are kind of growing up in an increasingly lawless state, and what that means for them.
Well, and what we're doing in the deforestation, trying to eradicate coca, is making their land virtually unusable.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely.
So
and
now,
of course,
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, the reason that they're going coca is because it's the only thing that's profitable, and the only reason it's the only thing that's profitable is because it's illegal. So it's kind of this self-licking ice cream cone, right?
Yeah.
So we have prohibition that it makes the product expensive, right? Which makes us want to go after the product, right? Which just makes the product more expensive. So.
Yeah, it's just
you
crazy.
talked about corruption, within the Mexican and everything police, and other countries. Well, did you ever see any corruption within the DEA itself?
I didn't. I can say honestly, in my time there, I didn't. Of course, it happens. I mean, if they tend not to be reported at the national level, but if you look around for these stories, and of course. The Drug Reform Coordination Network, DRCNet or StopTheDrugWar.org, does a great weekly roundup of that week's corrupt cop stories. And these are stories that really should be scandalous, but they're not. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, they inherently are, but they're not because nobody pays attention to them. They, it gets in the county paper, or, the local Fox affiliate, but they're never brought to the national attention. But it happens. I mean, there's not a week that goes by that some police officer in this country isn't arrested for corruption that's directly related to the drug war.
And when I was growing up, I was born in '60, and when I was growing up, the big, the tagline was "The man in blue is a friend to you." We all thought it was Andy Griffith, right? Hey, come on over and have some pie. Oh, no.
Right.
Oh, not even close.
Yeah.
So, here's the thing. No corruption, but I'm wondering this. Like we talked about a minute ago, sometimes it's who you know. One time I was in Baja, Mexico, having a drink in Guerrero Negro, and I met a lieutenant with the federales. We got to talking, and I told him about my family of law enforcement. This guy gives me a business card that he wrote stuff in Spanish on the back of. I have no idea what it said. I still have it. I should go find it and translate it now that I have Google and all that. But the thing was, he told me, you get in any trouble, he goes, you just give him this. I was like, hey, thanks. I couldn't read it, but I knew it was good. And so that to say this. You're never going to get everyone, even if we keep the drug war up. So how do you make a list? Who gets elevated to the top in any market? And is there such a thing as being allowed to operate in a market for tactical or societal reasons? I mean, is there an understanding that when people can't get their vice, that's when people get hurt?
I think that's absolutely true. I think that's definitely true. And, I think, in terms of Mexico, right, there's that kind of corruption is endemic, and it existed before America launched its drug war, and it will exist after America, inevitably, at some future point that I believe will come ends its drug war. But it's just a question of degrees. It's a question of the pervasiveness. There's a difference between a corruption, meaning a traffic cop in Mexico is going to shake you down for 100 pesos, and a traffic cop in Mexico is engaged in a kidnapping ring, right? Or
right.
I mean, literally, we had investigations where they were actively participating in murders and that sort of thing.
That is so bad.
Yeah. So that's just it's part of nature there. It's part of nature in most of the world. It's still, I would venture to say, in certain places in this country, part of the relationship between law enforcement and the citizenry, though not to that extent. But we don't have to go too far back in our own history, right? To look at the Chicago cops and New Orleans cops and Boston cops, and there was an awful lot of that. And needless to say, an awful lot of that sprung from Prohibition. Right? I mean, that's
right.
Talking
good
about
point.
the real spike in law enforcement corruption. That's when it happened. And it happened for kind of the same reasons we see in Mexico, right? Cops were far less paid, relatively speaking, then. They were in this dangerous environment. Their job was inherently dangerous. They were essentially forced to take sides with one criminal organization or the other. And that breeds corruption. That certainly does. I remember, another kind of epiphany was in Mexico. I was talking to a local police officer in Mexico, and Monterrey's kind of elevated, and it was chilly. It was in the winter, and it was raining, and he was talking about the rain and how cold it was, and how he needed a new coat. But he went to Sears, because Sears has some stores down there, and the coat was 600 pesos, which is I don't know, $40 or something. And he made the observation, and who has 600 pesos to spend on a jacket? And of course here we have, the people that he's supposed to be fighting are running around in Mercedes and BMWs and literally gold-plated AK-47s and that sort of thing.
Oh, yeah.
Spend millions and millions and millions of dollars to spend specifically on corrupting local law enforcement that, by and large, don't have enough money to feed themselves and their family and put a decent roof over their heads. So, that's part of the problem. It's not all the problem, but certainly part of the problem is the lack of professionalization, the lack of pay, and the threats. I mean, look, there's really a change in the relative balance of power in Mexico. Between non-state actors and the state government, the federal and state governments and the non-state actors in the form of the cartels, and it's very much in flux. And I don't think anyone knows exactly how it's going to end. And I don't think, frankly, that American aid, just sending money there and training prosecutors and cops is going to make it any better. I think
that's just going to
escalate the war.
Yeah, that's going to enrich the people that are already making all the money.
Right. Yep.
Yeah. Hey, you know what? Let's see, what was I going to... Oh, it was Uruguay. I didn't have it in my notes. That's why I couldn't think of it for a minute. I just read today that the government of Uruguay is talking about taking over the production and distribution of marijuana at the government level, and I stood up and yelled out my window.
Yeah, that's, all it's, throughout. I mean, of course, we see Vicente Fox, now kind of
right.
Calderon, probably most significantly in Guatemala, Otto Perez Molina. We see Uribe, we see like these leaders, Santos from Colombia, throughout Latin America, really starting to be a little bit vocal in criticizing the American war on drugs. Because
and I'm glad.
We import drugs and we export violence, and it's been that way for a long time. And that's an important shift, I think. That's part of the kind of the change in consciousness that I think is all part of the convergence that led to the Colorado and Washington State initiatives. But it's important. I mean, Latin American leaders are really seeing that, we've been trying this long enough. I mean, we've been 41 years down the same path. We haven't gotten there yet. Maybe it's time to try a different path. And when we see just the destruction and corruption and environmental damage, kind of the real corruption of all social institutions throughout a lot of Latin America,
right.
The cause of that is American drug policy. And I don't think we'd like it if, a domestic policy in Canada right? We're corrupting our police forces and killing 50,000 more citizens over the course of a few years.
Right.
We'd stand up and say, hey, cut it out, Canada. And that's exactly what's starting to happen. I think, I think that's very, very hopeful. I think it's very important to see that, just as the states are kind of standing up to the federal government, some of the states. We're seeing hemispheric partners stand up to the federal government and say, no, this is a bad deal for us, and it really is a bad deal for them.
Yeah, and I'm jumping.
Our politicians recognize that.
I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, but it sort of dovetails in with what you said. I get a lot of flack from people. They see me as a single-issue guy because of my marijuana views. But I really think that our prohibition of drugs, and particularly marijuana, affects every conceivable part of our society, let alone those foreign societies. And so I don't see it as a single issue when you see the correlation and causation spread across society. Do you think that's on base, or is that exactly the problem?
Oh, no, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, if you think about, just the numbers, right? 13 million, 19 million Americans smoke marijuana with at least some regularity, right? So that's
or more
20% of the adult population that has it, or more, right? I mean, those are, self-reported studies, so that, they're very fluid. Right, so what, that's 20% or so of the adult population that right off the bat has a reason to be afraid of law enforcement every time they see them. Right.
That's the fourth biggest lie.
Family members. Yeah.
That's the fourth biggest lie, right behind, checks in the mail and all of that is that, someone says, do you smoke marijuana? People go, hell no. Right?
Of course
Even though
not,
they have some
right.
Hell no.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and, and I think, kind of as an aside, I mean, I think one unfortunate thing is what we're going to start seeing in surveys out of Washington and Colorado is higher self-reported uses of marijuana. And what that's going to do is the prohibitionists are going to say, oh, see, right, they legalized, and now the percentage of people that use marijuana.
Oh, that's a really good
point. It didn't really double. People just aren't going to have that, the same pressure to lie and say no. So, I frankly don't think there's going to be much of an impact on use at all because, I think everybody listening knows that it's not all that difficult to find marijuana if you really put your mind to it. I don't think that, the risk, particularly in, Washington, Colorado, that were essentially, I don't want to say decriminalized because people are still being arrested, but largely decriminalized. There weren't the kind of real intense criminal sanctions for simple possession that some other states still have. I don't think the usage rates are going to skyrocket. What might skyrocket is the percentage of people saying, yeah, of course I do, right? And so do all of my friends, and, regardless of what we told you last month, the answer is yes, so I think that's something to watch out for. But yeah, it's kind of
another thing.
But yeah, it's shifted entirely, kind of the perception of the relationship between, citizens and law enforcement. And, we see that in, the tens of thousands of paramilitary raids, right? Executed across the country. They don't look a whole lot different than, what happened in Fallujah.
Exactly.
And they're not because it's essentially the same training,
really
the same
scary.
equipment.
And some of them actually are executions. They just kick the door down, they shoot and ask questions later, and they find out, oh, we got the wrong house. Damn.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And sorry, your dog's dead. Somebody might be dead, but
right.
It's the war on
what do you think about the DEA for getting prisoner Daniel Chong here a while back in San Diego holding cell without any food or water or toilet for 5 days?
It's incredible, but I think what's more incredible is how quickly the story went away.
Right.
That's a horrific abuse. It's just a horrific abuse, and I don't know the details. Maybe the story went away.
Have you ever been in that facility that he was held in? Have you ever been there?
I have not. No, I've never been to Los Angeles at all.
Because I can't even imagine. It was in San Diego. I can't even imagine how they could not hear him. I just can't imagine.
Well, and given the attitude and the sort of relationship we talked about just a minute ago, now if there's a guy who's going to say in my presence that I was afraid for my life, I would believe Daniel Chong, and I'll tell you why. Number one, because of the atmosphere, probably because of the way he was jacked around, and I don't know for a fact, but I'm willing to bet they probably roughed him up a little bit, threw him in there, and here he is like on his fourth night going, oh, my God, am I going to die in here? I would think that. I really would.
Sure. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And, and I don't know, like, what happened to the agents involved, but I if you or I grabbed somebody off the street and, locked him in the closet for 4 days without food or water and then let him out and said, oops, I forgot he was in there, you'd be going to jail. So, again, it's this double standard. It's this balance of power. And, right. I mean, kind of society has reached this agreement.
Yeah, that's the problem I have is the abuse of power. Because you hear stories about raids, and it's not just the raid, it's not just the fact that they were raided or there was an attempt at an arrest made or whatever, but some of the things that I've heard, stuff stolen, from the house and things purposely broken and damaged to be jerks,
Right. They do that a lot.
And it is. Yeah. I mean, it is. That's exactly it. It's all about power. And it's about punishing. It's really unfortunate.
Yeah, it's about deciding for yourself that you're the punisher, instead of the investigator and the rounder-up, guy. No, you're now the punisher, too. Okay, well, we haven't even had a trial, but I guess you're the fucking smartest guy on the planet today.
Right.
Yeah, sorry, I don't usually swear.
I'm sure I'm not the first guest to bring this up, but, the clearest thing about this is just, look at the dress and the vehicles and the weapons of law enforcement. Like you mentioned, 1960, right? My father was a cop. I mean, he was a cop starting in the late 60s. And, or in the 60s, I guess, 67, I believe. He went to work, right? He had a six-shooter. He wore a tie, right, and a blue shirt. Right. And then he was promoted, and he was the police chief, a suit to work. And now, you look at how cops dress. I mean, they look like soldiers. They
are.
SMGs, right? They carry shotguns, dressed in black. Of course,
our county just did that.
Quote unquote riot, right? They're wearing face masks and shields and jackboots and driving around in tanks.
It's
completely. It's not law enforcement. It's a military operation. It's not law enforcement.
It is. It's very militarized.
I'm sorry. I'm trying to say our county just did that. 2 years ago we elected a guy here that. Okay, I'm not going to be too mean, but I think bait and switch is fair. All right, so we get this guy who used to be an LA cop. We're up here in the Triangle. And you know what? Now, every single cop we have has a black uniform. They've now gotten 2 canines. They have seized around $300,000 already in the last few months and some 300 pounds of marijuana. And I've noticed a definitive a rise in the level of aggression in some of these fellas that I knew before the sheriff. And the militarization of the police, when it's unleashed on everyday regular citizens that use marijuana, is an evil and it's a crime against humanity. That's just my rant for the day.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, you take these I'll say kids. I'm old enough to say, 20-something-year-old cop, a kid, right? You put him through military training, teach him to be snipers, dress him up in a military uniform, right? Give him put him in these armored personnel carriers, essentially, right? I mean, it's a full bureaucracy, right? This law enforcement, paramilitary law enforcement infrastructure. And the reality is there aren't that many psychopaths in the country. There aren't that many murders in the country. There aren't that many. It happens and it's tragic, but it's a pretty small percentage of the population. So what are we going to do with this infrastructure, right? With this multi-billion-dollar law enforcement and prison, right? Infrastructure, right? That has to keep growing, right? We have to find a way. No police department ever says, we could really do with 2 fewer cops. Right?
Yeah,
no warden or state director of correction ever says, we could probably afford to close a prison or 2, right? It has to keep growing. It has to keep growing. Well, what does that mean? You have to find more guilty people, right? And if there aren't enough guilty people that are guilty of violent crimes, well, you have to make criminals out of somebody.
Yeah. Hey, you know what? Here's a question from one of our listeners, and how does someone get a permit from the DEA to grow marijuana? And is that even possible if you started your own, say, pharmaceutical firm?
Currently, it is not possible. And I don't know, of course, there are still a few legacy medical marijuana smokers who were brought into the program, I guess, in the 70s.
Yeah, I know them, actually.
Great. Yeah, fortunately, I don't know exactly how that program came about, but currently, kind of astonishingly, marijuana at the federal level is a Schedule I drug.
Oh, I know.
Say that it has no medical value and a high potential for abuse. Neither of which are true, of course.
Right,
but,
and it's also to say that it's worse than cocaine or methamphetamine.
Right, meth, yeah, absolutely.
Schedule II.
Yeah. Right.
Oh, yeah. I downloaded a document from the DEA website called The Truth About Marijuana, and I got to tell you, you know what? It would only take a very small amount of reading the conclusions of the Schaefer Commission, another legacy of Nixon that he decided to just, throw under the bus. But just a cursory reading of some of the Schaefer Commission would denounce almost every single bit of it. Is there just this jihadist belief in these false facts in the agency and dissension about those false facts is just a pink slip? Help us understand how otherwise good people sign off on such horrendous policy.
That's I get to ask that question with some regularity. I really do not have a good answer for it. I mean, I think, there's a certain percentage of people, in DEA, in law enforcement, that are very much like the temperance movement, the alcohol prohibitionists.
Right.
Who just, for personal, religious, moral reasons, just think it's wrong to smoke marijuana or drink alcohol, and are kind of gravitate to those positions, both in law enforcement and policy making, and enforce that. And of course, coupled with that is that have a view of government, right, and the relationship between government and the people that we know best, and right, we're the enlightened ones, so we're going to tell you not to do it, and whatever it takes to make that happen, we're going to do. Beyond that, I think it's a lot of inertia. I think public policy is hard to change. Minds are relatively hard to change. What government is doing is generally a trailing indicator, right? So we see, 50% of the people supporting the legalization of recreational use of marijuana right now, and finally, right, the leviathan of bureaucracies at the state level is starting to change, and maybe we'll see, and I believe we'll probably see in the next 10 years the even more leviathan bureaucracy of federal government start to change. So,
because they don't want politicians because it's a political thing.
Right. I mean, I think, and also, right, that's exactly right. They
don't want to stick their neck out until the numbers are there to support them.
Right. You're right. That's exactly right. And, I really applaud it on both sides of the aisle. I mean, there's a small number that have. I mean, Barney Frank, Jared Polis, Ron Paul, that's about it. Rohrabacher to some extent, California. It's a small number. But, it's a small number that keeps getting reelected, and it's a small number that's in line with 50% at the national level. One of the things that makes me so encouraged that the Justice Department will not launch an all-out assault on Colorado and Washington is the margins by which both of those referenda passed. I mean, there's the legal calculus about whether, they could, file for an injunction under preemption and all that. But I think, the political calculus is that, marijuana is more popular in Colorado than President Obama was. So, is he really going to go and take on that issue? I don't know. So it's entirely a political decision. That's encouraging. And again, I think that's, it's how slowly government moves. As you said, it's, the just inherent risk aversion that all politicians have. And it's budgets. The ONDCP budget is about $26.5 billion. If they were to say we're not going to go after marijuana, that would mean, okay, well, how much of that $26 billion do you spend on marijuana? Right. Well, probably about a quarter, and we don't want to lose a quarter of that budget.
I hate that use it or lose it whole thing. Hey, I do have a philosophical question for you though, because I saw that you actually, you hold multiple degrees, but one of them is a bachelor's degree in religion, and I wonder, do you see the hand of God in marijuana? I do personally.
In marijuana, if I would say whether I see the hand of God in marijuana, or
how about this? How about
people that put people in jail, I would certainly have to say marijuana. And I don't use drugs myself, but the people who smoke marijuana, even regularly, that I have been around, are more peaceful than the average person, and a hell of a lot more peaceful than the average cop. So I guess I would leave it at that.
I didn't mean it sort of that way. What I meant was, I've got a little bit of an understanding myself, and when I read the Bible, I see that there's a God of purpose and design, and I see that in Colossians it says that nothing was created except that what He created, and I see that on the seventh day it said that God had created it all and said it was good. I don't see anywhere that in the Bible where it says Satan can create anything. And then when you add on top of all of that two other facts, the fact that Paul, in all of his travels and all of his church starting and in all of his writing back and forth to give these people instruction, it was never even brought up, not once. And then on top of it, marijuana and its cousin hemp can give human beings everything they need to live, and it grows everywhere man can live. That just reeks of God to me.
No, you're right. I mean, you're absolutely right. And, I'd never thought of it in exactly that way. But, particularly I think if you look at kind of like, right, the juxtaposition between creation, natural creation, which includes marijuana, and, what we've created out of it, right, which would be pharmaceuticals and chemicals and, right, genetically modified food as opposed to natural foods. I mean, kind of things that are created by man are just apparently inferior to things that are created by God. And, we push things that are created by man in the forms of all kinds of pills on all kinds of people, including an awful lot of kids. So no, I absolutely agree. And I know at the opening of the show you mentioned Cashy Hyde, and that's a great example. When you look at what
right.
Conventional wisdom would have done to him, as opposed to what his parents found with medical marijuana.
Right.
I wish that story would get an awful lot more attention.
I just feel so bad for that family because, when I heard, I don't want to say never mind because it's too important for that. But when a father has to have his child die in his arms, and he had something that was working, and then it got taken away, you just can't fathom where he might be at right now. And I really feel bad for those parents right now.
Yeah, I do. I couldn't imagine myself, going through that. And I certainly, needless to say, there's certainly my thoughts and prayers. I wish them the best, and it's needless. If an awful lot of good came out of it because his story and his illness and the testimony his family had brought an awful lot of people together and brought an awful lot of people hope. And I just hope that the word continues to get out enough to continue bring an awful lot of people hope and maybe bring some people to accountability. The ones that were responsible for that.
Yeah, and guys,
what was working.
When I mentioned it at the beginning, I was just kind of a little tore up, and I kind of flubbed it. I forgot what it actually was, but it's the Cash Hyde Foundation for you guys if you want to go look that up and see if you can show those guys a little love. Anyway, man, I think with the delay sometimes I leave Julie out, and so I'm just going to kick it over to Julie.
I'm wondering, did you ever get a chance to see, imagine that you did watch Michelle Leonhardt's testimony this last few months ago that she... What are your thoughts on that?
It just goes, again, inertia, that somebody can go in front of Congress, be that demonstrably terrible at their job, and walk away with the same job and the same power and the same policy-making role as they had before. It's astonishing.
I know, which makes me think that it's really not about what we're told. It's about that there's just like so much more going on behind the scenes than we're even aware of.
Yeah. I think it's size and its power. If DEA existed to go after people who are addicted to methamphetamine and cocaine, they'd have to be a much smaller, smarter agency, and they have no interest in that. It's an awful lot easier to steal money from people who are driving down the highway with some cash in their pocket, and to go after, marijuana for lots of reasons. There are more users. It's bulkier. It's just an easier target to go after. And but her testimony. It wasn't funny because it's really quite an indication of how poorly thought out our policy is, and how disingenuous the DEA is in executing it.
It's almost like the old days, back in the days where they had this thing called a writ or a bill of attainder, where, the powers that be could just criminalize an entire, people group for whatever reason. You know what I mean? It's almost like that was the whole point of marijuana. prohibition was,
Yeah, no, I mean, there's no question about it. If you look back at, yeah, I mean, the Anslinger days, there's no question that was the kind of the intention. That, marijuana is used by this segment of society that we want to target, so let's do it. And I think really the reason that, that public opinion has changed so much is that, use of marijuana has become, relatively widespread and culturally accepted, and it's not a bunch of crazy jazz musicians that want to go out and attack
right.
women. I mean, that's
right,
there's a better understanding there. So,
yeah.
sure. So yeah, and that's why ultimately the policy is going to change. I mean, it has to. I mean, I just can't believe that anything this bad it can last much longer.
I think the internet was the doom of bullshit policies like marijuana prohibition. Why? Because, just the self-reporting is 25%. We know that has to be at least 10 or 15% shy, probably. And so, there's so many people that want it to end, they just can't, stand out in the open and say it because they'll be canned.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. Yeah, and I hope, even though there's the, kind of the negative side of, giving that, that line of argument to prohibitionists that, legalization has increased use. At the same time, I mean, the normalization of marijuana is a good thing at the end of the day. So, it kind of will facilitate bringing about more rational policies, I think, and eventually in all states, and I think at the federal level. But yeah, you're right. I mean, I hadn't thought about it, but absolutely, the internet's been incredibly important in that regard. Because especially, right, kids, kids grow up hearing what the teachers and, their resource officer in their school has to tell them they're getting a pretty incomplete picture.
Oh, my word. Hey, one last question, because we're running low on time, and I guess it's sort of a self-serving question, or at least maybe for some of my friends. Do you have any advice for people angling to be players in a legal marijuana market based on your experience watching covert groups?
Wow, I tell you, I don't know. I mean, there's obviously a lot of people are going to be trying to get into that, but there's an awful lot of people with an awful lot of technical knowledge right now that just finally are able to put that to illicit use. So I don't know. Right, and we saw that, when medical marijuana was enacted, marijuana legalization was enacted in so many states. So I don't know. I will say this. I think, that the counter argument that some politicians have made that this is going to invite the Mexican cartels to just come up and set up shop in the legal regulated market is absolute nonsense. I mean,
I know.
That didn't happen. I mean, it's absurd to think, right, that Mexican cartels are going to go to Colorado and, submit for licenses.
Oh, I haven't even heard that.
Have the health department inspect their facilities. I mean, it's laughable. So I can say that I give that a 0% chance. In terms of people who want to get into the business, I don't know. I mean, if I had any good ideas about that, I'd probably move to Colorado and keep them to myself. So I don't know.
Maybe keep your head down is the best thing we can come up with for now, till the smoke clears.
Yeah, for now.
Man, we're running really low on time, but it's really been great having you on. It's been great talking to you, Sean. We love LEAP.
Thank you, Sean.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Yeah, we really appreciate the support. And if I could really quickly plug our website, it's copsaylegalize drugs.com. So that's LEAP's site, and for anybody out there that isn't familiar with the organization, I would really invite anyone to come and check it out. There's some great people involved in it. Some really people with very impressive law enforcement backgrounds that have seen the light. And I really it's a great site and a great resource and a great group.
Yes, it is.
And we have a link to that also on our website.
Yep.
Great.
All right. Thanks, Sean. Good night.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Have a good night.
All right. You too.
You too, Sean. Thank you.
So you guys be sure to visit us at our website at CannabisNationRadio.com, where you're going to find more information on tonight's guests and links to get to other information and interviews with Sean Dunagan. And be sure to like us on Facebook.com/ReformWarrior. You guys, if we can't keep drugs out of prisons in America, how are we going to keep them off the streets? We can't. And every guest that comes on this show puts another brick in the wall of rational drug control policy.
And I think what people need to understand is that we are not saying that drugs apart from marijuana are good, that people ought to do them, or there is no place for police action in America, but rather what we are saying very loudly and from many disciplines in America is what we are doing is not working, and we need a new approach, especially when it comes to cannabis. The only people that are still supporting this failed policy are the people whose industries profit off of the spectacle and the misinformed.
Yeah, Julie, I think we need to raise our voice in this country and, you know what, try to channel another great Republican and say, Mr. Obama, tear down this wall. So until next week, you guys be safe out there, and good night from CannabisNationRadio.com.
Good night.
You're listening to Cannabis Nation with your hosts, Mike Booten and Julie Rose, right here on LA Talk Radio.